Anmarie is the former director of the institute that I'm now directing. Elizabeth is the former chair of Women's Studies and has done a lot of work for the Institute and the former McGill Center for Research and Teaching on Women. And Brian was a key architect behind the development of our undergraduate program in sexual diversity studies. So I have a lot to thank them for in terms of what's possible to do here at McGill. And Professor Davis has been part of several key conversations about the fields of women's studies, gender studies, and sexuality studies. And if you're interested, you can find some of them on YouTube after the event, please. Wow. Brian will be providing you all with more proper biographies of our panelists and will moderate the conversation. He will also tell you about how the conversation is going to proceed. Before I turn things over to him, I do want to thank Professor John Sosky. I think he's in the back over here somewhere. Professor John, can you just raise your hand for us? Thank you so much. Professor in the Department of History and Classical Studies, who was responsible, largely responsible for bringing Professor Davis to McGill to give a public lecture last night through the Beatty Memorial Fund, which was fabulous. Thank you for that. He also came up with the idea for the event and was a key organizer of this afternoon's conversation. I want to thank him for bringing such a great idea to us at the Institute, so thanks, John. I again thank our panelists. I know that Anmarie has been lecturing for 4 hours already today, and that Elizabeth just came from her lecture course, so thank you both for your willingness to do more talking with us today. And finally, I want to thank our staff at the Institute for making this happen. Kaylee Woodyard, who's our Director of Communications, Wilson, who's right there behind the camera, Wilson Blakely, who is our Administrative Coordinator right by the door, and Sam Thrift, who is our Student Affairs Coordinator, I think, who is womaning the booth just outside. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian so we can get the conversation started. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Welcome to you all. I think it's often said that there is no more romantic place to be on St. Valentine's Day than Leacock 232. Canoodling at the back is allowed today only, but please remember that you are on camera. It's a very great pleasure to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists this afternoon. Most historians are not well known outside the small plots of lands that they cultivate. Most of us are legends only in our own lounges, if that. Natalie Zemon Davis is one of the rare exceptions, renowned not only across the historical profession, but also in allied disciplines and even beyond the campus. In a teaching career spent at Brown University, University of Toronto, UC Berkeley, and Princeton, she has mapped out and lived many of the big transitions in social and cultural history over the past half-century. She was, for example, one of the first in North America to teach a course on women's history at U of T in 1971. Her succession of books and essays, including The Return of Martin Guerre, Fiction in the Archives, Pardon Tales, and Their Tellers in 16th Century France, Trickster Travels, and most notably for this panel, Women on the Margins, have transformed scholars' understanding of the early modern world. She is a past president of the American Historical Association, the 2010 recipient of the Holberg Prize, the nearest equivalent for historians of a Nobel Prize, and last summer she was made a Companion of the Order of Canada, this country's highest honor. Anmarie Adams is a graduate of McGill and of UC Berkeley. She is director and William C. MacDonald professor at McGill School of Architecture, a past director of the IGSF, as you've heard, and chair of the Canadian Council of University Schools of Architecture. She is the author of Architecture in the Family Way, Doctors, Houses and Women, 1870 to 1900, and of Medicine by Design, The Architect and the Modern Hospital, 1893 to 1943, and she is co-author of Designing Women, Gender and the Architectural Profession. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Jason Hanna Medal from the Royal Society of Canada, and a YWCA Woman of Distinction Prize. Her current work focuses on bodies and space, including a study of gender-variant children at home, the design of long-term care institutions, and how hospitals cope with death. Her upcoming book on that topic will be called Death Comes to the Hospital, a wonderful title. Elizabeth Elbourne is my boss.
So say something nice.
So I really do have to get this right. Elizabeth is a graduate of U of T and of Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She is the chair of the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill and a former chair, again, as we've heard, of the Women's Studies Advisory Committee. As well as an astonishing number of articles and book chapters, she is the author of Blood Ground, Colonialism, Missions, and the Contest for Christianity in the Cape Colony and Britain, 1799 to 1853, which won the Wallace Ferguson Prize of the Canadian Historical Society and the Joel Gregory Prize of the Canadian Association of African Studies. Her current massive project is a comparative study of Indigenous settler relations and humanitarian intervention in the white settler colonies of the British Empire, as well as studies of particular white women involved in abolitionist and Aboriginal rights movements, with a focus on the ambiguities of gender and colonialism. Welcome to you all. Well, let me explain the format for this panel. The idea behind the event is to draw on themes inspired by Natalie's work in order to explore broader questions, especially in women's gender and sexuality studies. Each of our panelists will be speaking for a few minutes about her own intellectual trajectory and some of the current concerns of her work as related to the broad topic of the panel. I will then follow up with some questions to facilitate the conversation. My role here is to be a kind of a Michael Enright on CBC Radio's Sunday edition. Those of you familiar with that, I don't quite have the right plummy, mellifluous radio voice, but I'm working on it. And then after that, we're going to open it up to you, the audience, for questions and discussion. So let's begin with Natalie's opening statement.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. The pleasure of being with Anne and Elizabeth and with you. Sorry. So thank you very much for this invitation to be here, to be part of this exciting discussion, to be sitting between Elizabeth and Anne, and thank you for your introduction. I have lived such a long time that my 5 to 10 minutes of describing my trajectory is going to be very compressed. We're going to do decades in seconds. I began back in the 1950s, and I'd say on into part of the 60s, as a social historian, a social economic historian. And I think, Brian, you began similarly. I think your own work on the socioeconomic history of British industry and workers. A number of us in gender studies began, Joan Scott, began with that kind of start, with workers, artisans as our base. We were sort of used to doing, scrounging around for research sources for a topic that at the time we began it was unusual. So I began as a social economic historian, working on artisans, printing workers especially in the French city of Lyon, and the women as actors were present in some of those early studies. Thinking of Anne's work on hospitals, one of my early papers, done partly in connection with my earliest doctoral work, was on the poor of Lyon and the hospitals which received orphans. So women were, of course, actors, were present in that story, but they weren't central issues. Gender was not a central analytical category, to use Joan Scott's phrase. By the end of the 60s and the 70s, my work shifted. It still remained in France in the next 2 decades, shifted beyond the urban setting of Lyon to include rural settings in many other cities. And the most important shift was adding to social history. And I've never set aside social history or socioeconomic, adding to it as a continually important element of posing questions and looking for sources. I began to be very interested first in anthropology and then in the techniques of literary scholars to bring them to bear on my evidence as an historian. Women were very much still, I'll say a little bit about that. These were the books I wrote among the books I wrote in those years were The Return of Martin Guerre, where performative issues were very present. Really, in terms of literary things, fiction in the archives, pardon tales in their tellers, were examples, plus many essays in which issues of festivity were foregrounded. Now, simultaneously with this multicultural, this multidisciplinary move, I began to working on women. My first essay, I think, was published in 1971, exactly at the time that I began to move into thinking about anthropology, and as I also began to think about working on rural figures in France. And from then on, I'll come back to that move. That was the same time I taught the course with Jill Kerr-Conway. From then on, women were simply part of the topic, and gender issues were part of the theme. So that when I did The Return of Martin Guerre, Bertrand was as major a figure, and thinking about her as a woman and her particular choices as a woman, as Arnaud de T, the dazzling imposter, or Martin Guerre, the husband who went away. And I'll come back to fiction and the artists, but women then just became more than just occasional actors. They became central to that period. The third, and I know I'm just zipping ahead, the third shift in my work, when I think about it, was really not till the late 80s and 90s, where I began to do research beyond France and beyond the Catholic and Protestant groups that had interested me, and worked, Women on the Margins was the book in which I did Catholic women, Protestant women, and a Jewish woman, and moved for the first time from Europe to the Caribbean in the case of the Protestant woman who spent several years in Suriname, looking at its flora and fauna, especially at its insects, Maria Sibylla Marion, and to Quebec with Marie de l'Incarnation and the indigenous peoples whom she hoped to convert to Christianity. And that, for me, was an extremely important geographical move in which these historical, social, cultural, anthropological approaches, literary approaches, indeed, could be put to work. And then finally, and again, I'm just using these big categories, starting in the late 1990s and up till today, to really work beyond Europe. That is, to try to situate myself as an historian who was not only working on Europe or looking at things from a European perspective, but to shift perspectives constantly. And the books, the main examples, I have continued to do during that time things on France. My book on the gift in 16th century France, I published in 2000, but at the same time, the Trickster Travels, which is, for those of you who don't know, it is about a North African Muslim, Arab, who spends part of his life, having been kidnapped by pirates, in France, in Italy, for a time as a Christian. So, and my current work is bringing together different groups of Europeans in Suriname to tell a story particularly focused on slaves. On two projects. One is 4 generations of a slave family, where the women are the critical members not just because of issues of sources, but are the critical members of the families. And another, what turns out to be a separate project, is on 6 generations of a Jewish settler family and its slaves, where the men are particularly important on the settler side and the women are particularly important among the slaves. So just, okay, there's a big, all those decades. But just to give you a sense of the categories. Now, gender, just to make a few comments, gender has been important both in terms of discovery and in terms of opening out new vistas for me, really at each point after, partly as a result of my working with Jill Conway, I began to see how central and creative gender could be in thinking about history. For instance, when I said I moved to anthropology, this partly came about because I was puzzled by certain carnivalesque features of artisanal life, especially kept by men. I was interested in peasants, but it especially came about in the early 70s because I was teaching and trying to understand women. And there was no way, back at that period, that I could ask the kinds of questions that I could think about how to get source materials without looking at what anthropologists were doing. At that Shelley Rosaldo, for some of those who remember those earlier periods, and others, they were working on the Philippines or wherever. It wasn't that I could use their source material. It was the kinds of questions that they were asking about family life, about sexuality, that weren't being necessarily asked by social historians at the time. So there was just no way that you could teach. That I could conceive of teaching a course on the history of women and gender. I called my course, with Jill and I called our course Society and the Sexes. That was what we called it in 1971. But it was always a comparative course. When I got to Princeton, I taught the course with an anthropologist. So as I say, that particular move wasn't only generated generated by gender, but it was quite instrumental in doing it. The move from being an historian of France to deciding to work on other parts of Europe and religions beyond Catholic and Protestant was specifically in connection with women on the margins. I had been teaching for decades, a course, first at Toronto, then later at Berkeley, and then at Princeton, in which those 3 women, Leacock, Maria Sibylla Marion, and Marie de l'Incarnation, were being used. I would translate the French for the students and so forth. And there were little bits and pieces, and they would read Leacock's autobiography. But I suddenly thought, these women, I want to put these women at the center of a book, not just be a chapter or two as like Bertrand. I want them to be right out there. I want them, the story of 17th century Europe, to be carried by them, not to have them, though I called it Women on the Margins, the idea was to center them. The idea was to put them at the center. So they were responsible for my simply deciding, well, I'm not going to work on just France anymore. I'm not going to work on just Christians anymore. And it's about time. But it was in the course of doing that I began to, that I had noticed, and there they were, Marie de l'Incarnation was working with indigenous people, and Maria Sibylla Marion was using slaves as her field workers to get her insects. And I thought, am I going to write a book where I show the adventurousness and the experimentation of these European women and not pay attention to the fact that one of them is using slaves and the other has this complicated and interesting relationship with women she's converting? No. So I did try in that book to do a little bit to up the voice, the best I could, of the First Nations women in Marie's chapter, and I went to Suriname and I worked in the slave archives. But it was really after I wrote that book and I thought, I am not going to just write anymore just from the perspective of Europe. And I'm going to just, so that was when I decided to take whatever time was needed to try to work on somebody like Leo Africanus, or his real name was Alwazan. And it was really, those indigenous women of Quebec, of Nouvelle-France, these Iroquois especially, and those slave women, one of whom was an Indian slave, who were the ones that made me take that final move. So that's one thing. Second thing is that I thought about my work. Sometimes starting on a gender project, starting a project with gender foregrounded, such as Women on the Margins, starting off thinking, I'm going to write about women. I'm going to write about women and gender and male-female difference. Sometimes it led to really new ways of thinking about things. The whole notion of seeing the possibility of moving between centers and margins really came from starting with the women's case in that 17th century book, and then trying to see, well, this is really a meaningful way also of thinking about men's experience in certain kinds of ways. So sometimes it's by starting with the gender. I think that that I could move in what seemed to me a helpful new direction. A second kind of example has to do with something that maybe everybody here has been through or didn't need to go through, was abandoning the notion that I had as a progressive historian back in the 1950s of evolutionary stages, some version of a Marxist or a post-Marxian idea where you move from this stage to this stage and certain things ended from the stage before, to abandoning that and to think about a very different kind of way of characterizing what happens when things change, to see things relationally. Well, this is something that had already been important when I thought already I'd had to think about it in regard to the industrial trade union resistance activity of French workers when, for early along, it seemed to me that some of these forms of what we now call trade union organization, called compagnonnage at that point, some of those forms should not be dismissed as archaic or as pre-industrial or as primitive, because they persist in ways that continue to be constructive, continue to be important. Or when I looked at forms of violence in which women and men were involved in the 16th century and saw them not as an early form, but as one that was continually present as an alternative in resistance life, it was already breaking down the notion that first we have this way of people, and then we have this way, and these earlier forms disappear. But it was especially important early along, already in the 70s, in working on religious women, comparing the Protestants and Catholics, that you could really see that it wasn't just a question of Protestantism bringing all the positive gains, marriage, literacy, and so forth, the end of the celibate priesthood, with Catholics somehow lagging behind as a traditionalist religion. But on the contrary, that both there was transformation in both issues, and both were different, you might call, forms of modernity, of early modernity, if you want to use that term. So in a very compressed way, I'm trying to suggest how powerfully the study of women across the board made one rethink loyalty to a stage theory way of looking at things. To give an example that is still current of what I mean by that, the current writing still echoes some of McLuhan's, brilliant though he might have been, simplistic notions that first we had this way of communicating, and then we had this. First we had the voice, and then we had the I. Whereas in fact what you see is with printing, the voice and the I both continue, voice continues, in an interestingly new relation, or writing, scribal things persist with printing. They don't disappear at all, but in something new and relational. So, but for me, it was having to work on women and think about how what change meant for women that was quite instrumental. Two last points. One is that sometimes in my own work, and I'll be very interested to hear how this works out for Elizabeth and Anne, sometimes in my own work, the insights came not from starting with a gender, but starting with a totally different topic, in which, of course, I would ask about gender at some point, but it didn't start with what was it like for women to be caught in a criminal case and try to get a pardon. When I did the book on pardon tales and fiction in the archives, which was about requests that people made to the king to get pardoned for a homicide, which was in fact they claimed it accidental or whatever, it had been in a duel, whatever. When I started that, I was interested in storytelling. I was interested in using these letters asking the king for pardon as a source for all kinds of popular narratives, quite apart from the fact that they were interesting criminal cases. I started with the question of that, of how did people tell stories in the 16th century. Here is a very precious source. And it wasn't until I got into the topic that I then saw that there was a very interesting gender variable. And I didn't start with the usual questions that you have, well, what were the men doing, what were the women doing, and are they alike or are they different? I just started with that. And then the gender surprise came along the way. And similarly, I won't elaborate on it, but similarly with my book on the gift, I started with the gift and practices of gift giving, and it was only later that I found some very interesting, that the female case had something very interesting to say about ideas of reciprocity, about ideas of exchange. And I will be interested to hear whether Elizabeth and Anne have had that experience, or whether people in the audience, that sometimes the most creative way to get into a gender issue is not starting with it, starting with a new entrance. Well, the final thing here are just to, without elaborating, say some questions that either things I've been thinking a lot about and still continue to be very important in the work I'm doing on slavery, and I'm wondering if others have not answers, but just two things that have been part of my reflection over all of this period of time, but that gender made me especially think about. One was the question of people having multiple identities rather than single identities, multiple identities, multiple sites, and allied with, which might place them sometimes in a relationship to other women or other men, other times with cross-gender associations. And allied with that, the constructing of relations both in terms of asymmetries of power, that is, situations where you're talking about resistance or domination and its variants, but always simultaneously trying to look at relations of exchange or reciprocity, or its variants. That is, and those of you who are working on gender or peasant studies or slavery, anything, will be constantly, I'm sure, thinking about whether you're going to construct the issue in terms of which polarity you're going to choose. That has been ever since the 70s has been a recurring issue in my own work. The other big question that maybe is interesting to some of you, when I look over the decades of here now, especially of teaching, rather than not so much of my own writing, is the different debates we've had, and that I think are still very current, about what determines gender, which we had from the very beginning. I mean, are we going to talk about how much do we bring in body and biology? The biology and physiology is determining cultural environment. I won't go through that trajectory in all the debates we had. I think, and then I think is in an extremely interesting state right now in our life and in our reflection. And in case anybody is working on that, where does the debate now stand? And is it a creative debate? Which is it a debate opening up new vistas? Is it a debate that should be closed down? Where do we stand? So those are just some final general thoughts that maybe others want to pick up on in the audience or up here.
Thank you very much. Annmarie.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you, Brian and Elizabeth. I just want to begin by saying what a great privilege it is to be here today, and thank Carrie and John for inviting me. like you, Natalie, I didn't begin with gender questions, but came upon gender as a great surprise and as a way to understand questions which had stayed with me for many years in school. I think as a McGill undergraduate in the 1970s, I was just simply too naive to even think about gender issues. What I really wanted to do was understand as much as I could about the visual and the material world, which I loved, and especially the built environment. So I studied art history because I thought that was the way to simply sit in dark rooms and look at images of beautiful things. And I did that for a few years, but was quite unsatisfied with it. And what I'd like to do is suggest that there is this theme of longing in all the decisions I've made throughout my career, a longing that the people in the next field have the better questions about the built environment. So when I was studying art history here just in the arts building next door, I met a bunch of architecture students. They took some art history classes, and it seemed to me that they understood more about architecture than the art historians did, and they convinced me that I could take a course in the School of Architecture, but warned me that the professor, Professor Peter Collins, hated art historians and hated students who were not in the School of Architecture. So I summoned up my best courage and went and asked Professor Collins if I could take his class. And in fact, he immediately told me that art historians were only good for cocktail parties, but that he would let me in his class. It changed my life, and in fact, I think it's kind of interesting that a whole series of extremely conservative, rigorous scholars have pushed me further and further into women's studies. Peter Collins also committed suicide the year that I studied with him, which also changed my life. He told me to go to UC Berkeley before he died, and I bought a car and drove to California as fast as I could, trying to become an architect. So I studied architecture at UC Berkeley, many worlds away from the arts building at McGill, it seemed. And it seemed to me that the architectural historians understood buildings far better than the architects. So in fact, I started moving towards architectural history, and immediately when I graduated with my professional degree, signed up for a PhD in architectural history, studied with Del Upton, not a very conservative but very rigorous scholar, and decided to do a dissertation inspired by Gwendolyn Wright's Moralism in the Model Home. Wright had been a PhD student a generation ahead of me at Berkeley. She had studied American homes, so everyone said, why don't you just do a British Gwen Wright study and you'll get a job in Canada. So that's what I did. And I raced off I got a shirk grant, because everybody got shirk back then. It's not like it was today. I raced off to England to study in the best architecture library in the world, the Royal Institute of British Architects. I got there with my shirk grant, and there was a sign on the door saying it was closed for renovations for 6 months. You know, it was before the internet, and there was just no way you could know that your library was closed unless you had telephoned. So I was really embarrassed, and I didn't want to tell my advisor. But somebody said to me, well, the Wellcome Institute, this really cool library about a mile away, has all this architectural stuff that nobody uses, but it's kind of has to do with medicine. So if you could just angle your dissertation to be a bit more about health, you'd be all set. So it sounded like a really good idea, and I met a bunch of history of medicine students. I had never studied history of medicine. They took me in, I joined their reading groups, they taught me everything they know, and I wrote Architecture in the Family Way, and I've been writing about women, gender, and health since then. I think my real interest in gender came from being in a male-dominated profession. Architecture, that is. Art history was not very male-dominated. Architecture is about 20% women, the profession. And in terms of professors. We only had 1 or 2 women professors at Berkeley, and here at McGill, I've been here since 1990. I was the only woman in the School of Architecture until a year ago. So 23 years as the only woman. I think the material world is a great way to track women in terms of evidence. And I'm really interested in using, in not studying women as makers, which is what the generation ahead of me did, but in fact, women as users of buildings, women who move through space. And, well, maybe that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. And let me also echo my sense of privilege of being on this panel, and thanks to everybody. I have not had the long and illustrious career of Natalie so far, so my comments are going to be a little bit shorter, but I thought I'd highlight a couple of points of intersection and tension that might be useful for the panel. The first point I wanted to make is the role of longing in the quest for the absent woman, which was something that as an undergraduate informed me. I began studying history as an undergraduate at Trinity College, Toronto in the 1980s, when despite the magnificent things that were going on that I didn't know about, for the large part, history was gendered male. In my core disciplines, I had precisely 1 female professor in history over the course of both my BA and MA, 1 visiting sessional professor in philosophy in what was considered the slightly girly field of aesthetics, and 1 female teaching assistant. A professor once asked me to switch conferences because he didn't want to have too many girls in a single place because they wouldn't say anything. And I remember being happy to catch the occasional glimpse of a queen going by. And this was entirely consonant, even in the 80s, in an outside world where there seemingly were no female disc jockeys, drummers in rock bands, bus drivers, garbage collectors, sports writers, or priests, and precious few doctors. So the absence of female professors was less remarked upon. And of course there was feminism on campus, of course there was a lively feminist movement, if only I had known where to look. But my kind of experience as a beginning student was experiencing absence and a longing to replace, which I think is something that's missing from the experience of undergraduates today. And as an older person, that's something that's hard to remember when interacting with younger students who don't have that formative experience of the missing women. And that always gave me a profound sense of the necessity of returning to women despite the multiple shifts in the field. So in that sense, women's history came as a revelation and relief. The second point I wanted to make, however, was that the intersection of women's history with gender, or with race and class, is of course, deeply complicated. The idea of women's history is intrinsically liberating, as we all know. And in my own personal trajectory, I turned to South African history, became very interested in the intersections between British issues and South African issues, looking at colonialism in 18th and 19th century South Africa. And it became, really, in the atmosphere of the 1980s, extraordinarily difficult to talk about women's history as an intrinsically liberatory phenomenon in a context of apartheid South Africa, in which I would say, on the one hand, radical historians who dominated the field focused intensely on class and on the need for history to be a liberating history that could write against the dictates of apartheid, or black consciousness writers for whom ideas about common blackness, identity forged through oppression, also trumped notions of gender. So in that context, to write about gender, particularly as a white outsider, seemed almost like a spurious way to claim a kind of privilege. Could we evacuate the guilt of colonialism by making links between women? And clearly often the answer was no, this is a dangerous enterprise. Looking back, I think that eviscerated many things that we should have talked about, including things like gender violence, which was simply unexpressible in the context of debating apartheid South Africa, and yet which seemed to me to have, as modern current events suggest, to have been deeply important. So it seemed to me that just as I discovered women's history, it became deeply complicated by the intersecting oppressions of race and class in a colonial context that seemed to suggest that women's history in and of itself could be a way to escape the complications of colonial privilege. So I think that is perhaps the second overarching thing that for me has always informed ways of thinking about gender and women. A third intersection was the turn to masculinity that I found both liberating and constricting, and perhaps that's something we might return to, whether the turn to masculinity becomes a way to return us to simply talking about men once again, coming full circle. But in my own work on colonialism, I have found it very useful to think about masculinity as a critical tool of colonialism, as a way of emasculating the colonized, of entrenching colonialism. I consider performances of masculinity on the part of the colonized as a tool to combat colonialism. So I see masculinity as a critical site of struggle in colonial ventures. Subsequent work on sexuality and slavery underscores for me also the enormous importance of, again, performances of honor, of systems of honor, of claims about masculinity intersecting with sexual oppression and with slavery. So I have found that actually a very enormously useful way of opening up the field. So I'll leave that as a third category, questions around masculinity and the turn towards masculinity and focus on male experience. In my more recent work, I've been somewhat inspired actually by the wonderful, by Natalie's concerns. I've been trying to look at settler indigenous relationships in a very large picture, but trying to keep it small by focusing on particular families. I'm looking at 3 families that moved in complicated ways through colonial space in the late 18th to early 19th century. One Mohawk family, a white settler family, and a humanitarian family based in Britain. In doing that, I find myself, I think, returning to Natalie's work. How is it possible to use individuals to trace enormously complicated processes? How does movement through space change the way that we think about history? I think that's one of the great strengths of gender history, is to move away from the national, to think about complications, movement away from the history of the nation state. How does memory shape colonialism? A lot of my work at the moment is also turning around memory of colonialism, stories told about colonialism, and so I'm interested in actually hearing Natalie's perspectives on the historian as a storyteller, and how does that intersect with the way that people in history tell stories, because it seems to me that's a profoundly important part of your work, and that comes back for me again to this larger issue of telling stories about women, telling stories about the absent voices, but how do we tell those stories in a way that doesn't reinforce relationships of power, by putting the power of the historian back into the story so centrally. A final point I want to make is that in this work I've actually find myself coming back to these questions of overlapping systems of power. I have been working on a Mohawk family, began by thinking that I was doing work that might reveal something about power relationships by looking at Mohawk women. Last week, found an account of a woman that I had been thinking about by the child slave who had been incorporated into her household. And I found an oral history that she had given as an old woman in her 90s about her experience as an 8-year-old child who had been captured in New York and taken to the home of this Mohawk family. And on the one hand, she said she hunted with the family. It wasn't like the completely subordinate relationship that she might have had in a different kind of household. The children all went hunting together and they played together. And yet she also talked about the Mohawk woman cutting her face and disfiguring her because she had spoken back to her. Those kinds of intersections of power are things that are revealed through storytelling, but that raise deeply ambivalent questions that make it hard to talk about a single category as a liberating category. So that's a little bit where I'm at the moment, and enormously eager to actually hear what Natalie and Annmarie have to say about some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, I think we have probably enough questions and items here for an entire semester's worth of seminars. Let me begin with a very straightforward question. Natalie, you talked about offering the first course on teaching women in the U of T in 1971, and you called it Society and the Sexes. Elizabeth talked about the missing women when she was an undergraduate in the 1980s. Could you both, or all three of you, explain what you see as the main differences in teaching women's history from the 70s onwards, and what has changed? Are we moving in the right direction? How far have we come?
Do you want to start?
I was afraid you'd say that. I think that what's changed for me is the experience of the students. That it's a different environment, and that students come with very different concerns, which I wouldn't want to enumerate because I don't particularly want to speak for my students, but I've still been struck by, for example, interest in gender fluidity and breaking down categories of gender, of finding things that were absolutely central for women in the 80s as of less concern, and other issues of more concern. So I think that teaching in itself is this fluid process of interaction, which I have found fascinating over the years. I'd be very interested in hearing how things have shifted for you. The huge shift that I found in teaching is shifting towards thinking about gender systems and as I said, masculinity, away from an initial focus on women, women as the missing actors, towards gender as a system of power, which I think does inevitably and has profoundly changed the field. It's also changed a lot of the politics of the field.
We called our course Society and the Sexes specifically because we tried to talk about men throughout. We didn't do it with the elegance and the subtlety of masculinity studies, but we really did. We did try to talk about the construction of masculinity in the 16th, 17th century texts and medical texts, and about the variety of roles. We talked about roles offered to men in a Catholic society where you had the option of being, or for women too, but an option of being a celibate, and what this implied for. So we actually tried to do it, and we were very committed to this at a time that there was something of a conflict, and there still is. So it was when I spoke about this in Paris about 4 years ago, between those who felt that the course should be on the history of women. I mean, we always had women quite important in the course, and all the time I taught it. But it seemed to me that you couldn't discuss the topic without it being relational and doing. We called it the sexes because that was the only term we had. I discovered. Joan Scott reminded me that I had used the word gender in a lecture that I gave at the Women's Berkshire History Conference in, I guess, 1974. But I hadn't thought about it as a category that you could put in your title. I think that the work on sexuality, the addition of queer studies, the deepened work on masculinity has, I mean, over the decades. I haven't taught a course since 1996 when I retired. So I'm not constructing syllabi. But from what I could see in my own time and everything that I've heard, I think this has enriched the program. The work that has been done in global history, global feminisms, the critiques that have come from different parts of the world. If I were to construct a course now, and I'm sure it's going on here, it would be very, very attentive to this new work, extremely so. And especially the advanced courses at Toronto, where we have a very, very large, exciting student body of people, many of whom are first generation going to universities and come from many different parts of the world, for whom the tongue spoken at home may not be English. It seems to me that even a standard course, without anything fancy, is extremely important, and they are very well attended, these undergraduate introductory courses. I have it from people from different fields. But if I were thinking about designing especially the more advanced courses, and I'm sure that very exciting things are going on here, I would do a lot of reshaping from what we were doing in the early days, including not necessarily making them start out with gender as the topic, but some other topic in which gender could then be reenacted. I think that starting off, and I'm thinking now of history, with a course on the architectural themes that Anne works on, would be more interesting than necessarily going through the same standard text, maybe there aren't be, on theory. Something that would just open the field in new ways and allow for comparisons, startling comparisons of different cultural circumstances. So those would be I guess those would be some reactions from somebody who is no longer right there in the classroom. Every once in a while I come across a text and I think, oh, I would just, I would love to, I would just love to put this in such a course if I were doing it again. And often they are texts, primary texts from a non-Western setting that has been recently translated and is now available. Something that would just open it up. But as I say, I'm retired.
Well, I might, great question, and I might compare the course I teach now once in a while, which is called Sex in the Single Building, to the kind of courses I took as a student at Berkeley in the 1980s. One difference between the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Engineering is that I actually put sex in the title of my course to attract students to it who think it's going to be about sex. That's very different than the way things happen on this side of the campus. But seriously, I wanted to remember that I was lucky enough at Berkeley to have a pioneering women's historian, Mary Ryan, on my dissertation committee. And she, in her History of American Women course, referred to it as an add women and stir approach to history. And I think that's just so different than what we do now, which is to push Mary's cooking analogy. We might have it as a more blended history or a completely pureed kind of approach to the field. So then in my own discipline of architectural history, as I said, the generation before me looked at women architects. My generation completely resisted that and in fact saw the spaces, mostly homes, that we studied not as spaces of containment or limitation, but actually as evidence of resistance, that women had lived in wonderful ways in modern cities and houses. And that's a huge difference, that move from a negative kind of add women and stir to a very positive modernism wasn't so bad understanding of modern architecture.
You talked about blending. Elizabeth talked about the possible problems of the focus on masculinity as potentially bringing back a renewed focus on men. What are the costs and benefits of this shift away from add women and stuff?
You go ahead, Natalie.
Just 2 points. One, in terms of, I just want to comment, if I may, on add and stir, that we, in defending, going back to the 70s when we were trying to defend these courses, which we had to do. Mm-hmm. We had to do it at Toronto, they sort of thought it wouldn't make a difference, so we didn't have to defend it. They let's just let Jill and Natalie do it. But at Berkeley, we had to defend it, and at Princeton, I remember we had an entire day of faculty meeting where we had to marshal all our forces to get these courses approved. So in those years, the argument we really made, and we meant it, that it wasn't just an add-on. We claimed, and I think we were right, that the addition of women and gender courses, and we began to use the term fairly soon, would make a difference in the way you thought about history. Mm-hmm. For instance, in some of the kinds of things I said before about periodization and what you meant by a period, in the way you thought about state building, in the way you thought about the thing that you said about the difference between yourself moving from women as makers to consumers, mm-hmm. the work that was done and it came about through people interested first in women as industrial workers and then as women as consumers, that the putting of consumption mm-hmm. on the map in doing, just let's stay with Europe, early modern European history and colonial history really was often pioneered by people who looked at women. Mm-hmm. So that the argument that it was not just going to be an add-on, that it would change, not revolutionize everything, because you don't want to make extravagant claims, but that it would make a difference. I think that, as I said, we tried to make it early, and I think it has been borne out. I don't think. I see what you're saying about the masculinity. I think that if this is taught right, I mean, any topic can be excluding or can impose a certain approach. Any topic can be treated that way, but I think that bringing in more consciously the study of masculinity is an enrichment for the study of gender. That working on slavery right now, the implications of this has been talked about a great deal in the popular text, but the implications for the slave community, for being enslaved, for men and women, are complex, and they partly depend not just on gender, but on status and origin and so forth. And it's an enrichment, I think, to do them both. So I know why people say this, and I'll just give you an example of this feeling. I understand the feeling. When I mentioned this Paris reaction, in Paris when I had suggested different ways of constructing courses that I thought would lead to new ways of generating perspectives and theories and interpretations and new ways of doing comparison, and not always just talking about the history of women. Not that people only do, but what I was greeted with a really strong denunciation by an old-time French feminist, probably about my generation, who said, if we do that, we will just, if we give up on talking about the history of women, we will lose the battle. So I understand that perspective. I understand it, but I think and I think one should respect it. I think this is what I would call a creative debate. If I may just add this one thing, that in our field to begin with, in my generation, we were having this kind of argument about those of us who wanted to be doing family and do class as much as gender, with those who are more committed to looking at the history of women, female solidarity, and I still think, just as I think that the debate about what the variables are that define gender, I think that this can be a creative debate. In a way, what we are talking about now, that tension, I think, should persist in the field, should maybe be central in courses, and let it keep going. There's no simple resolution here, and there perhaps shouldn't be. But the two different ways of talking about the field could persist in sparks with each other.
I actually totally agree. I wouldn't for a minute try and defend returning to the bad old days of add women and stuff. And I think that what we're trying to do in gender studies is get to a realistic understanding of the world in some ways, and that is not possible without encompassing a wide range of things, including masculinity. I think that is absolutely central to the field. It's transformed the way that I think and do my own work. So I'm not for a minute wanting to step back from that. I have observed in practical university politics that there are a couple of pieces of roadkill when you make that shift. And that might include community alliances in some respects. It might include some generational tensions. But I actually don't think for a minute that that has anything to do with the intellectual argument for I think the value of transforming the field. I wouldn't want any of the roadkill, though, to be a sense that you could shift the field to the point that you would no longer include, at some level, discussion of women's experience and gender oppression as important and I would say central. But that is only a hope that the roadkill could be limited rather than any kind of sense that this isn't a fundamental central transformation, necessary transformation in the field.
Should I say something? I'll just add my own anecdote that I'm now trying to move into both queer space and studies of masculinity and architecture, and that I feel like I absolutely am using the methods I developed in my work on women in space to study men in space. So for example, I have a new paper on men's clubs in Montreal. I've always had this theory, I call it big house theory, that any building designed for women or girls looks like an overblown house. Daycare, schools, anything, parts of hospitals. And so I'm trying to test that big house theory by looking at 3 men's clubs in Montreal. They definitely are big house. They are big blown up houses, and but the power relations within the floor plan actually work in the opposite way. So I don't see them as one way or another. Studying masculinity and space is helping me to understand women in space.
Let me ask you a related question, sticking with this sense of your trajectories over the last 2 or 3 decades, and bring up the question of risk. As women and as scholars of women and gender, to what extent do you feel that you have taken risks in your careers, and how has the level of risk shifted over that time period? And what risks would you encourage students to take today?
Well, I didn't, the things that other people thought were risky, I just thought were fun. I just thought they were wonderful adventures. And I didn't care what people thought. I mean, I do care under some circumstances, but not here. And I think that some of the experiences that I had when I was young sort of got me not having to think about what my teachers thought or what my immediate superiors thought. Again, I'm just, since you asked, just drawing on my personal experience, since we were sort of political outcasts in the when I was in my 20s, a wonderful period because I was having my children, but we had all this business with the McCarthy period and so on and so forth, the House Committee. The whole question of ordinary graduate student success or success in my early years as a student, well, that was just way off. That wasn't, I don't recommend that as a teaching experience for the young people here. I'm just saying that in my experience, the whole question of taking an intellectual risk was unimportant. This was just so all the things that I did, as I say, I thought they were just really exciting adventures. The one thing that I would not recommend to younger scholars is to take a topic such as, to do with a topic some of the things that I did in Trickster Travels, where, which is, as I mentioned, the book about this Muslim, where I not only did a lot of work in areas where I had a great deal of evidence, because I had this man's, that Arab manuscripts. I had a great many manuscripts, and I could work from them to build up in a reliable way his mental universe. That was and I didn't have to keep using words like maybe or perhaps or so forth. But I also wanted, and I was very committed to this. But remember, I was doing this when I was retired. So it wasn't a doctoral thesis. I was very committed to wanting to bring him to life, not only as a mentality, not only from his text, but as a Muslim Arab who had been kidnapped by pirates and had converted to Christianity. And I had to work very carefully, because his text, and I talked about this actually when I was here at McGill several years ago presenting this book, his text didn't yield directly evidence where I could always talk about this. I had to work very indirectly. Moreover, in terms of gender, and I may have said this in McGill back in 2006, he did not talk, for various reasons, about having a wife. And I said to myself, I am a historian partly of gender. I am not going to leave this topic without thinking about family issues, gender issues. Sexuality was easier because he talked quite a lot about that. That part I could handle. But I wasn't going to do that. So I used techniques of collateral evidence and various ways of analyzing the text. Collateral evidence was very, very important. What the pattern of young men of his age. And I wrote that. I should add that I was glad that Muslim specialists, Moroccan specialists, thought that was very plausible. But it did involve using the speculative terms. I had to say maybe, perhaps, we can assume. I took that risk willingly and absolutely committed to it, and I was very frank about it. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily. I wouldn't recommend centering a doctoral dissertation or one's very first book in an area where you may have to constantly make moves of that kind. And it's not because I think one shouldn't be adventurous. It's partly. I don't know whether you would agree with this, but it's partly when you work and work and work as an historian, you accumulate enough evidence, enough practice, enough work, so that you know where it's more likely. You're more likely to be on the right track when you move in a speculative direction. This is, some fields like my husband's mathematics, you could do it when you're really young, like 20 or 18. But in our field, this accumulation of materials and research skills can pay off. I don't mean that young people can't do wonderful work, because I've been hearing about fabulous projects today. But there's a way in which things pay off. Wouldn't you say? I mean, you're still very young, but wouldn't you say it pays off so that when you move in a speculative venture, you have a better sense of where you're on good ground. So that would be the kind of risk. But taking that you would be a little bit more, you'd be cautious about moving there. But for working in new fields, it didn't seem like risky to me at all, and I didn't care. As I said, I didn't care what people said.
Actually, do you find yourself ever thinking when you're telling a story, am I taking too many risks? Because I find that in my own work, that I find myself, particularly telling biographies, there's such a temptation to fill in the gaps, to be the storyteller, to have this flowing narrative. How do you, in your own work, navigate that risk?
Well, I'm feeling it right now, and I wish I had made the discovery that you made the other day about your mohawk. As I write about these 4 generations of the slave family, let me tell you what I think the positive gain is in taking the risk. And then came back to the risk. I have just finished a section of this book on the slaves in which I asked what it meant to have grown up and and been scarified in Africa, and then you bring your children into the world, and they are not going to be they are not scarified. or for the non-Jewish estates in Suriname, what happens if you are used to circumcising the boys, and actually the girls very often, as was the case in many of these communities, and that doesn't happen with your son and daughter, and so on. And then a whole bunch of things that I knew were part of the world in which these particular enslaved persons grew up, and that they were, some of them are reproduced and some are not. And I wanted to ask about, in the life of an individual man and woman, how they would react to that and what they would do. And many other very intimate things, because I'm trying to tell it. And what is the value of doing that? It at least, even if I can't resolve it for them, and I'll come back to what it means to try to resolve it for them, at least it raises the question. It's a way of talking about the issue. An issue which, if you were doing a study of large groups, you might not think to raise. I felt that this was the advantage in the text on Al-Wazan, where I talked not only about a marriage, I mentioned it as a young man, but I even much more speculative, a possible marriage in Italy. What that allowed me to do was to talk about, to narrate, to talk about comparisons between Muslim marriage and European marriage in a very precise way. So it opens the subject, which you then speculate about. It allows for thought experiments. And similarly, as I write about the slaves, and I think, why am I giving myself so trouble to try to do this when it's very hard to get evidence not talked about? And yet it must have been a question. It is not possible that you would grow up believing that scarification was a mark of identity of a person, and sometimes especially of free persons of high status, and suddenly you're not doing this. This must have been an important issue. So it seems to me, that seems to be the value of raising it. If you leave open possibilities for your figures, so you asked about how you have a voice that does not impose the historians. I think that you try to find a narrative style that leaves open some choices for them, for choices for ways of feeling, and doesn't writes with both vigor and vivacity, but in a way that allows for some irony in regard to the self. You've got to find that tone. I'm thinking as I'm saying this, is this a gender thing, that are women more likely to write this way? Men not going to write this way, but I'm sure the men in the audience would say, no, we have as many styles as you do. Would you say that you have as many?
Yes. Do you want to weigh in on this? Okay. I could ask. Oops. Put that on. I could ask many more questions, but I think we need to open it up to you, the audience. Please, when you ask a question, identify yourselves and use the microphone in front of you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Sam Tota. I have 3 reasons to be here. Number 1, I have 5 sisters who can't be here, so I'm here to listen to what you have to say. Number 2, I want to make a connection with what's happening around the world on women issues, and I haven't seen this institute or other institutes or institutions speak up on these matters, specifically what's happening in India on the rape cases, and what happened in Pakistan about the 17-year-old. So the third reason I want to have comments on why you don't speak up on those issues, and I don't see anything in the newspapers, and other people less knowledgeable than yourself speak on those issues. The third reason is I had the pleasure to listen to Ms. Adams more than 10 years ago about the history of the toilets. in a province where people don't know their own history, I thought that was a real courageous talk to give us the history of the toilet. So I came again to listen to what you had to say about different issues. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments? Or?
Maybe Carrie.
Thanks for your question. Regarding the recent cases, we would love to have a panel or something talk about this at some point, which we think would be a great idea. I know many of us are talking about it in our classes. It's part of our conversations with our students and with our colleagues. So we are beginning to talk about this, but if anybody would like to talk to me later about the potential of having some kind of event around that, I would be very, very open to that. Yeah, and Elizabeth?
I think you've actually gone to the heart of a crucial issue, particularly gender violence. I also would say sometimes that one feels constrained by not wanting to make cross-cultural claims, to speak out of turn. And yet I think what you get at the heart of is really that's not as crucial as speaking out on these critical issues. And it seems to me we do come back again and again to core issues around gender, rape, violence that persist and are hugely important. So thank you very much for that question.
Hi, my name is Disha Jani, and I just had a question for Natalie about when we're speaking about the historian's voice and the interaction with your subject matter, the prologue of Women on the Margins, where you have this imaginary conversation with the women that you later write about, just the thoughts behind that and how, whether that was more of an emotional journey for you or whether that was very much a consideration in your research, how these women would have taken your questions about them.
No, it was, it was certainly the second. I did think about how they would react, but it was also, excuse me, it was an effort to do exactly what Elizabeth said, to locate me. I mean, they had left me this material. This material was their gift to all of us, and I'm using it in my own way. And I wanted to show that space between their own way of looking at the world and my own. And of course, I was writing it, so in some sense, I had control over it. But I wanted my readers to think about that it was a way of decentering me, be in the margins with them. That was a risk when I wrote it. I had a lot of trouble with my editor, who didn't want me to put that in. She couldn't you write a regular preface? And some people were very bothered by it, but I love it. I really thought that was the best part of the book, to create that, to allow people to see. Well, it wasn't necessarily the best part, but because the best part was their lives, but to allow people to see that disparity and to recognize that in some sense I was modeling.
Kate.
Yes, I'm going to change the direction of the questioning, if that's okay. I have a question for Annmarie. Is that okay? Or do you want to carry on the storytelling? I'm happy to.
No, that's fine.
No, I'm ready for you, Kate.
You're ready for me. Here I come. Annmarie, I have a question for you about you're training architects. You're training people who are going on to design buildings and work in the world. And I wonder, could you just give us your reading of the extent to which sex and buildings, thinking about gender, does it make a difference? Or are there social forces out there at large that are changing the practice of architecture in the world in ways that you would detect?
To put an optimistic spin on it, the growing interest in sexuality and gender and space is not part of the core curriculum. However, I think that as we attract more and more enlightened colleagues and many women professors to speak about these issues, it seeps into studio courses and courses on building regulations and fire codes and all of the things that don't seem very connected to these issues. But I also think that that most of the really interesting work is done at the PhD level, and at the school we're lucky enough to have the only and largest PhD program in Canada with 40 students. So we have this really dynamic group of students working on many gender issues, and I think that makes a huge difference just in the school. I'll only add that it's quite important to study architectural history in the context of a professional school. I made the point of doing that myself, and I think it's a way to change the profession, to have that coexistence of research and practice in the same building. Thank you for your question.
Norman.
Norman Ingram from Concordia, professor of modern French history and chair of the department. First of all, thank you very much for the three presentations. I thought they were very interesting. I was struck, however, by the fact that all three of you, in varying ways, seem to have described a kind of intellectual itinerary that began in socioeconomic history or the built environment and ended up in some way dealing with issues of gender and sexuality. And I'm wondering whether the three of you would like to comment on the political question, because it seems to me that that's one of the conundrums that's sort of at the heart of what Joan Scott is on about in that famous article from the American Historical Review. If gender is in fact a useful category of historical analysis, then she posits that it has to be about statecraft, it has to be about diplomacy, it has to be about military history, it has to be about high politics. And it seems to me that is the case, and it has been discussed in that light by a very few historians. And I'm thinking, for example, of Jo Leacock and her work on feminist pacifism in Britain, and the link that she makes between a profoundly gendered view of British political history in the First World War period and in the interwar period, and issues of gender. I'm thinking also, if we take the sort of masculinist view of Harry Oosterhuis's article on medicine, male bonding, and homosexuality in Nazi Germany, which really posits a profoundly gendered way of looking at the German state and suggests that gay people in Nazi Germany were excluded because of their opposition to an essentially masculine conception of the German state that was posited on the men rather than the family. So I'm wondering if the three of you could comment on this political issue, which I think is something which we sometimes neglect to our detriment.
I think you're quite right that the gender issue must be brought to bear on political life, statecraft, state building, state representation, diplomacy, and so forth. Just because we haven't necessarily done it doesn't mean we don't agree with you very strongly on that. Some of the work that's been done, I did a little bit of contribution to this in terms of political symbolism, on the establishment of the French monarchy, and it was has been very much influenced by the laws in regard to succession in France, and political theory in regard to gender. Everything has made a difference, and including finding analogies between structures of family and political thought in France. And that has been done by scholars both in France and people like Sarah Hanley and others in the States. So I just think you're pointing to extremely important areas in work in post-colonial studies. I think that gender has played a very important role in some of the work done on the Raj in India. It's only beginning, I think, to surface in regard to colonial regimes in the Caribbean, but I think that you've just identified an important area, and we have seen some progress there. It just so happened. I mean, I think some of your work on policy of missionaries certainly had a political aspect to it in some of your own. And I think you can maybe give some other examples. So here, thank you for the suggestion, but I think there is some start in that direction.
Well, I would take on board John Wells Scott's fundamental claim that gender ideology is a way of talking about power, and therefore it's a very useful way to talk about states. I completely agree with you, and I think you could certainly, in thinking about the construction of the colonial state, there are many powerful gender ideologies at work, as well as control of the actual bodies of women as part of the colonial process. So I see these things as deeply interconnected. Thank
you. I saw a hand up behind you. Okay. Good.
Alex Ketchum, a grad student at McGill. I know that there's been mention in this talk of moving beyond the national as a category of analysis, but there's also been talk about the importance of geography. And between the three of you, you've worked at institutions in the US, Canada, and the UK, and obviously during different time periods. But could you talk about the differences you saw in these debates about women as a centered category and gender in these different geographical settings of the US, Canada, and the UK?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Although it's hard to distinguish geography from generation at this point, because I've been here rather a long time. So I'm drawing on memories of the UK that are rather distant. But I would say it was much harder slog in Britain. But again, that may be something to do with generation. I have a structuring memory of being at Oxford in these very, well, I hate to say it, terribly male spaces, these terribly male seminars where people, you only spoke with great trepidation, and I feel that there was a structuring environment there that had a certain impact, but also sharpened feminist debates. So I'd say that debates in Britain seem to me, in some ways, to be angrier, to be sharper, partly because of this ever-present infrastructure. I'm not sure everybody else would agree with me. I'm really just brainstorming here, but that was my own lived sense, was of very sharp debates, but against this huge background of inherited male privilege. It was kind of just absolutely everywhere in very visible, visceral ways. And my sense in Canada was of less intense, angry debates, and a greater interest, I would say, in gender theory, just again my own lived experience, greater interest in queer history of sexuality. Yeah, but I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Natalie. It's a really interesting question. Certainly it speaks to the ways in which contemporary politics shape what we think of as very abstract history. And my experience has been that contemporary politics always has an influence on what you're thinking about the past.
The main comparison I would make, actually, is between France and North America. I didn't particularly notice a huge difference between teaching in the States and Canada, but partly because in both places there have been courses established in the field, departments sometimes, or at least programs. In France, that it is still very much an issue, even though some extraordinarily important work has been published. There's a lot of in terms of publishing, not a problem. Maybe easier in France in some sense, since they love to publish everything and everybody reads all the time. But in terms of the academic establishment, it is still something of an issue. And people say, well, what about at the Collège de France? Well, there are, in fact, one or two people who are doing this at the Collège de France. But the fact that people will still say today, oh, but they're not there. Or what about it, where are they at the Sorbonne? It's still thought of as not central to mainstream history, even though if you look at, as I repeat, if you look at the books, it is very much part of the, of at least the world available for history readers. I think that there's less interchange between the people who are specializing in gender history and those that are working on mainstream history. I gave the example before to our colleague from York, excuse me, from Concordia, about important books done on queenship and its implications for early modern French political history. Well, the texts that were written there, and they're very good. They're good legal history, they're good symbolic history, they're very sound, which make a difference, are still not recognized by some of the mainstream political historians as relevant. And I think that course, that conversation, that exchange, that impact, that happens now, I think, in North America, that there really is an exchange between the specialized field of writing about gender and the larger. It's making a difference. This has to do with Joan Scott would have a lot to say about this too, but among the issues that affected that to begin with was a very powerful loyalty and an understandable loyalty to social history, which was very much associated with some version of class. Very powerful in France, and gender seemed sort of like the old phrases of bringing in some kind of middle class diversion. And some of the very best, the Annales school to begin with, was very reluctant to. Now it's changed, and this is a different picture. But it took a lot of doing, and then something about the structure of French academe, very Paris-centered. So you get certain groups there, whereas here in North America, maybe this is true of Britain too. This smaller world, the possibility of having different power locations, much more flexibility where you could set things up, made it easier to get things started. And then once they got started, the communication worked better, I think, across the different fields of the discipline.
I'll just comment on my experiences in California, and Natalie, you were at Berkeley too, I believe, that I think UC Berkeley in the 1980s was a wonderful university. I'm not sure it would be as satisfying today with all the UC drastic budget cuts. But I can say that the wonderful thing about it was that you never had to explain why you were doing a gender topic. It was just a normal thing. Nobody ever made you feel funny about it or embarrassed, except maybe your parents or something. But it was a very comfortable place to be doing early gender work, and having people like Mary Ryan in the history department supporting me was huge. I remember when I asked her to be on my dissertation committee, she said it was her 100th dissertation that she had agreed to, and that so like I was getting a special prize or something when you're the millionth customer. Anyway, so she was pretty popular. I'm not sure that being in the McGill in the 1980s would have felt like that, for example. So that really helped me. And if we can just return to the question of risk, which I never really answered. I took my job at McGill before I had even started my dissertation. That was a very big risk. And I guess thinking about the question of risk makes you think back about regrets. That was a really very bad thing for me to have done, except that I got this great job that I love. It meant that I really spent the first 3 years here just crying every night, worried that I wasn't going to finish my dissertation because I had to be finished by my first 3-year review. I think that shaped my dissertation to some extent. Maybe made it better because I had to write it so fast. But it was a very, very stressful thing, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody ever.
Right.
Hi, Brian Cowan from the History Department. Two comments struck me here, and they may not seem related, but I want to invite you to see whether there is a relationship. One was Anmarie's comment that everybody got a shirt back in those days. Okay, that's evidently not true today. There's something else that I heard that would evidently not be true, and that was Natalie's comment that, oh, we had to spend a whole day defending adding gender and women into the curriculum at Princeton. Well, I can't imagine that happening at Princeton today. I don't think that would be the case. I hope not. Is there, I mean, on the one hand, you might say, okay, well, here's one case in which we're facing academic politics of austerity. This seems to be the rhetoric that's going around all the time. And yet, on the other hand, there's a greater space for adding gender into the curriculum. Is there a connection here between these two phenomena? And, or, you know, to phrase the question differently, well, if these kinds of studies are being asked to go fund themselves, are they actually going to be able to survive in the future?
Can I just add my, thanks Brian, my personal strategy, and I think I've been very lucky in this way, is that my other beloved topic is healthcare and healthcare spaces, which is very, very important to Canadians and to Canadian funding agencies. So what I've tried to do is combine my interest in healthcare and gender so that the healthcare stuff can support the gender research. I think we have to try to think really creatively in the way we package our work in the landscape that lies ahead.
Just very quickly, I suspect that a problem with the funding crisis at the moment is going to be the difficulty of getting new topics on the table that funding committees are not expecting to hear, or that governments can't, you know, package in their list of things they want agencies to fund. I think gender is pretty safe, to be honest. There are many things that I can't imagine, because I don't know about them yet, that might not get funded because they might appear simply too novel. I mean, that's the risk of a reduced funding environment. You just reproduce what you know. And similarly, the necessary push to team grants and big studies, which I think is also part of this, if the funding agencies are giving large grants rather than a whole bunch of small ones, is it does also make it harder to have extremely innovative work coming up from the bottom, from people taking risks. So I think that's a great question, and I am rather worried about it.
I have a comment that which is really more of a question. I've heard a great many colleagues talk about the fact that gender studies programs or institutes currently, and this may not be true here, but currently are often dominated by very recent courses. That is things on, that is social studies, which is fine. I mean, sociology, health issues, things that are very much associated with our own day, or the late 20th century, and that those scholars who are working in, say, the longer history of gender, whether it's in the West or elsewhere, the historians, the literary people, the people in art history are continuing their work, and they may be friends of people in the institutes and the gender studies programs, but they're not closely integrated into the program. That most of the conferences that are funded through the center are very important. This is not a criticism of them, but they happen to be clustered around contemporary issues, and that it is more difficult for those working on earlier periods in one or another of the humanities to get funded. So this is really a question, and is this observation a meaningful one? And if so, would it be important for the institutes and the gender studies groups, the ones working, including architecture and the professional schools, to think about linking up with those working in, who are doing gender work, important gender work, in these other departments, going back to classics. I mean, you've got classics in this, but going back to classics, medieval period, or so that's really a question.
Well, our teaching programs, for instance, I mean, we have courses all over the university: Islamic studies, religious studies, history, and classics. There's a classics professor who was just talking to me last night about wanting to do a new course on, I don't know if she's here, on gender and textuality of classic Greek texts as well. Social work. We've got courses all over the place, I would say, and have quite a representation, in part because to run an academic program in women's studies and in sexual diversity studies, we depend on courses being taught in other programs where there are faculty who have gender studies approaches or feminist theoretical approaches to those topics. And so we require this interdisciplinarity because we only teach a certain number of courses under our own course numbers, for instance. In the Institute, we've had lots of different symposia. I mean, Brian, you were heading up one on the history of sexuality just a few years ago as well. I don't know if you had trouble getting funding for that. I don't think so. No. Did you? No. And I haven't had trouble getting funding yet either for, we just had a big girlhood studies symposium last fall, which had both historical work, it had work from Australia and other parts of the world, quite contemporary in terms of its sort of construction of what the issues are, but I'd say quite broadly interdisciplinary. I think that's one of the things that defines what we do, at least. And thus far, like from granting agencies in particular, I haven't experienced trouble with funding with that. It'll be interesting to see if we do, but as Elizabeth was saying, there's so much impetus towards collaboration and interdisciplinarity that those are always good things when you're asking for money. So the more one's able to do that, often the better. Yeah.
Good. Question at the back there.
Hi, Jeffrey Little from Concordia. This is a question related maybe to something that Professor Adams mentioned about being the only female faculty member in her area. But this question about, we've had this great conversation about how women and gender studies has progressed through the academy over the past several decades. Maybe my question comes to how have things changed for female historians of gender and sexuality and women's studies in the sense of being female academics and everything that's happened, or everything that we think about when we talk about being a female academic and the pressures and demands that are different from those faced by men.
No, you go
ahead. It's a very large question. I will say that I think academia is on some level really set up for 1950s guys with wives. And I don't think we've really got past that. I think that's not only an issue for women, actually, I think it's also an issue for men who might, for example, want to be involved in raising their children in a way that this model doesn't fully allow for. I think the biggest issue for me is actually that issue of, it wouldn't be the same issue for other people, so this is a very personal answer, but for me it's the issue of children incorporating family into a model that assumes that you will spend your 30s focused on the great works. And I do think that there are still issues of gender discrimination that I see younger people facing. So I think it's still a real issue, but I think that some of the structural issues are also affecting men too. But so, do you want to?
You go ahead, Natalie.
Well, as I say, I'm not teaching, but I talk a great deal to graduate students, men and women both, on issues that with questions that are raised as they think about their future. There has been a change from the 1960s when I was at the University of Toronto, where we had to struggle for the idea that there could be a daycare center at the university, and where there were hardly any women. I mean, there were one or two of us in the department, in a large department. And as I have said before, when I would go to a meeting, I would be, even though I had my PhD, I would be called Mrs. Davis, and everybody else would be called Dr. So-and-so. And I mean, that was an embarrassing moment. So things have, I mean, things really have changed in that department at Toronto now, where there are a number of distinguished, very active women, and both men and women have children. I was recently at UBC, and one of the graduate students brought to a 2-hour seminar his daughter, and that was fine. The most astonishing thing, I guess maybe this is different in child rearing or something, or maybe because her parents were Russian, but the child was a good girl, a 2-year-old, for a 2-hour graduate seminar. I thought this is unheard of, both in terms of child rearing styles and just that it was perfectly accepted that could happen. So that I don't want to underestimate the thing that quite apart from lack of acceptance, quite apart from discrimination and so forth, I think that the challenge of putting together a life as a parent and a life as a scholar and a teacher is present. I mean, that's a practical issue, even if there isn't discrimination. It's nice when you have daycare centers and some of the things that we had to struggle for, but this is something that we have to think about, and think about both social and political ways to make that easier for the young generation, as well as work for any attitudinal issues that are still present. But as I say, it really does look, compared to the 1960s, it really does look, it truly has improved. I'll use that word, progress.
Last couple of questions, Peter, and then.
Hi, I'm Peter Hines, McGill PhD in the History Department. Question, so a lot of this work that we've seen, it says sort of gender as a category of analysis can explain so much. How then do you account for that in, for example, you do projects in which, in my own primary research, I haven't seen a woman mentioned for about 6 months now. So how do you account for that? I mean, there's certain other categories, say class or religion or things like that, which you cannot ignore. You'll get called out if you do ignore them. But in this case, it'd be a massive shift. If you want to talk about something like gender, it's sort of, there's a weighty imbalance, right? All the sources talk about other things, and it's simply a matter of listing what they say. This is a category that, you know, it's pretty obvious by now that it should be used, but if you don't have the direct evidence, how do you account for any potential imbalance, or how do you use this in those categories?
Okay, I'm going to have the unfair advantage of knowing what you're working on. Okay. Since you work on British in India and the military and alcohol, not seeing a woman, 6 months of, let me go out on a limb here, guys getting drunk in homosocial environments, I think, seriously, I think that you could actually do some interesting work. There, you're not thinking about actual women, but about homosexuality, about ideas of masculinity. What is it? You know, the military is this deeply masculine institution, so it's very helpful to think about it in gender terms rather than just taking it as given. My other hunch is possibly that there might be sexual relationships with Indian women that are not being recorded in the records, and in that case, I think the silence is really interesting. The fact that you haven't come across a woman in an environment which I'm willing to bet there was a lot of sexual interaction is also, I think, important and interesting. So there you can kind of start with, okay, what is it that how is male society being constructed here? How are men thinking about themselves? What's masculinity doing in the military? But then also, what are the silences? So that's a huge issue in gender history. What's not being talked about? And then you go with the silences. So I'm hopeful.
I would just add to that, as important as it is to look at this gender dimension and the enrichment that might bring to your interpretation, it's also true, and this is something I was trying to suggest at the beginning, that gender is a useful category of analysis, but isn't necessarily the most important issue in a circumstance. The point is that you look to see in what sense it's present in shaping men's and women's relationships with each other and self-definition and so forth. It may not be the most critical thing. That's important too. There may be other issues, multiple issues of identity, origin, religion, all these, social status, economic interest, that might be the most important, and that's but it's just that you want to run that through as the gender. What is the gender possibility? How does it play here? And it may not play in a primary way.
I agree that it's not. You can't take for granted that gender is the only central, most important category of analysis.
Let's have one last brief question, please.
Hi, my name is Becky. I'm a graduate student in political science, so I have a question about politics. And specifically about women's history as a political act. So I'm thinking of someone like Elaine Flexner in the 1950s writing her big tome of American women's history. And that she wrote this as specifically like a feminist political act, right? That it wasn't just historical value, but it had contemporary political value. So I'm wondering, with the move to gender and masculinity, if that feminist political moment or capacity for history is lost. And if it's not lost, how does it play out differently? And if it is lost, do we need it? And I guess secondarily then, do you see your own work as political? And do you see it as political, and do you see it as feminist work? Thanks.
I think it's for Natalie, isn't it? I think just that whole question about women's history is a political act. Sorry, maybe we should turn the mic on. Sorry.
I didn't. We didn't quite catch the figure that you were.
Oh, Elaine Flexner? Or sorry, Eleanor Flexner.
Oh, Elaine. I'm not. I remember that book, but let me just address the question of how, and I'm sure that Anne and Elizabeth want us to speak about this too. I try to see my work, apart from the pleasure of discovery and so forth, I try to see my work as an historian as having a critical edge. Yesterday, Kate Deborah talked about my wanting to be a historian of hope, and in some sense, that's part of the story. But by hope, I don't mean necessarily sentimental or promise of progress or what have you, but that at the very least, history shows at the very least other ways of living, the possibility of things being different, and shows the complex possibilities in ways that we treat each other, in the ways we think, the range of possibilities, a whole range in affect and construction and conflict, and out of that comes the possibility of people thinking critically about, appreciatively sometimes, but also critically about the past and about the world in which they live. To go back to the first gentleman's comment about the deeply important and moving struggle for girls' education in Pakistan and Afghanistan and elsewhere, when we write about the history of the struggle for that education and the many centuries of arguments about it, it raises a kind of critical perspective that is relevant to thinking about it today and thinking about the continuum of that struggle. So the historian, in her role or his role as a historian, should not be manipulating the history to make a clear-cut political judgment that you do as a citizen. Your goal is to spell out the range of behavior and to try to make it understandable as best you can. Sometimes it's opaque and you can't. But I think having the possibility of having it a critical edge is there. And as far as, and this is true for a given feminist political position, but insofar as you are attentive to gender issues, the whole range of them, including sexuality and masculinity, femininity, insofar as you do that, your history makes people's antennae go up and think about this in other areas. So that would be my own sense of wanting I mean, just as I opened that book with a dialogue, I would like the book to open a dialogue, not set down a political agenda, but open a set of possibilities for readers to think about and argue about and run with on their own with their own ways of looking at things.
I like actually your comment, Natalie, about opening the issue of possibilities. It seems to me that in some of the actually truly horrible work that I've done on rape and sexual violence and colonialism, I feel that's opening up the issue of a range of possible behaviors which it's politically extraordinarily important to keep in the forefront of our minds, even if at any given moment we might not ourselves be grappling with those issues. So I see that as political, and I see discussions of colonialism as political and having contemporary implications. I also hesitate because I think there are many places in the world where women are engaged in struggles where the ability to write their own history is still very important to them, and where they don't necessarily have that space. It doesn't mean that I can write that history for them as a privileged outsider, but it seems to me that the politics of history kind of haven't gone away, and then that they persist. Even at the same time, as I also see the politics of history as deeply complicated and going in multiple directions. It's not clear that political history goes in one direction, that there's one political claim that you can make from history. But for me, history writing always has that level of political engagement, I hope.
And I guess just to add what might be obvious, that I think if we, in something like a professional school of architecture, if we teach people to understand the built environment from many, many different perspectives, not just the perspective of the designer, we will, I hope, end up with better buildings, because the future architects will have those multiple perspectives. Just to connect to Elizabeth's work, I worked on Mount Cashel Orphanage just before it was demolished. I'm very interested in demolition and trauma, interviewing the victims of that violence, because I've found in looking at hospitals too that many people blame buildings for traumatic incidents. I'm very interested in that, and how that is later reflected or symbolized in the memorials that replace demolished buildings. So during the Mount Cashel court, during the hearings, victims actually marked on a floor plan where incidents occurred as a way of remembering. So I think, although the building's gone, if we understand how those child victims saw the staircase and the shower and all the other places of horror, we'll make sure that we don't ever build that situation socially and architecturally again.
Thank you very much. Please join us for a reception outside and have some wine and cheese. I'd just like to thank our three panelists for tremendously inspiring reflections and words over the last couple of hours. Thank you very much.